Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K-12 School Shooting Database, and I publish the weekly School Shooting Data Analysis and Reports Substack. You can subscribe for free. This week, we are going to be talking about what I think is one of the most interesting and consequential academic papers that I have read in quite a while. And if you read a lot of academic papers, first, I'm sorry, because most of them are extremely dry and boring and wordy. But this paper is unique in that it talks about school shootings in a way that I have not seen before. And it has a really approachable story that it tells about how we need to be looking at these incidents differently. So the guest on the show today is Dr. Anna Nassour she's a sociologist in Germany. And her paper, The Interactional Pathways of Mass Killings Towards a Novel Understanding of Rampage School Shootings, is available now. So Anna, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So before we get into your paper and your research, my first question is, why is a sociologist in Germany, a professor in Germany, where you've got all these other things going on in the EU, why are you looking at school shootings?
So I come from a violence research background. I studied protest violence before during my PhD. And then I'm sort of interested in crime and violence as one of many other aspects where I look at how do people behave actually in specific situations. And I got interested, I think, in the topic of school shootings when I was at a violence research conference where Catherine Newman presented her book on school shootings, which I really recommend. And we talked about the phenomenon of school shootings. And I thought there's so much media attention on this. There's so much money that is spent on school shooting prevention. And what she talked about was that there's still so much that we don't know about why school shootings actually happen, how we can prevent them. And this got me interested more broadly in the topic of school shootings. But I had, since a long time, had a focus on the United States. I've had done research stays in the US. The second year of my PhD, I spent at Columbia. I spent some time at NYU and at Yale for different research projects. So I always had sort of this connection and interest in the United States. And I think as a violence researcher, this is also a country that is quite interesting because there is more violence in the US than in European countries. And it is interesting because it connects to so many different aspects of mental health care, a welfare state, gun legislation, so many big topics that are interesting to us as sociologists are connected to the question of why do people become violent and what leads to a violent outcome.
And what was different about this paper, which I assume may have been a through line to some of your other research, is that you look at this through the lens of sociology, through symbolic interactionism. And that's a theory that Mead came up with. It's kind of one of the foundational theories in a lot of sociology, that we have this shared language or shared system of symbols and behaviors, and everything that you're saying, doing, seeing, perceiving is all this kind of shared system of interaction that we use to kind of base the way that we interact with other people. Had you looked at that previously with violence before coming into this paper about mass killings?
Mm-hmm. So actually, I started as a researcher. I did my studies and I was very enthusiastic about sociology, but I never really thought I would do my PhD. And then I made this observation on situation dynamics in protests, and this became my PhD project. And what led me to this project was that in the last year of my studies, I had two very different courses that I took. One was in history, one was in French cultural studies. And in both of them, I wrote a term paper on protests and protests escalating. And the one was on a protest in France in the 1960s. The other one was in Italy in 2008. So very different countries, different decades, different protest groups, different police strategies. And what caught my attention was that the way the protest happened was so similar, nevertheless. So the situational interaction dynamics from the moment people got together to march during this protest until the situation escalated. And so this became my PhD project. And I stuck with this this idea of understanding what happens when people actually get together. So I'm very much interested in all of the different projects that I do, and people having specific motivations and strategies often going into a situation, but then often things turn out very differently. And the advantage is that now we have all of this video data that we didn't have for the longest time. So you just mentioned Mead and others. Symbolic interactionist theory has been a staple in sociology for a long time, but for the longest time we couldn't really look at these theories in detail because we didn't have the data. Now we have video data that captures CCTV data that captures school shootings. We have people filming with mobile phones. We have drones filming. So we have all of this recent technology. And a lot of this is very easily accessible also online. Videos are uploaded on YouTube and on other sources. So we now have a new opportunity in a way to look at how does the situation matter? Do situations actually shape an outcome? Does it matter how people behave during a protest for escalations to take place? I looked at robberies and the situational dynamics of robberies. Do robbers actually always get the money because they are armed, they have a clear plan, the other person is surprised? Nevertheless, a lot of robberies fail. So I was interested in how does that actually happen that situations turn out so differently? And this is one of the questions that I also asked in the rampage school shootings in this paper that we're discussing, because here you would assume this is a very unlikely case for the situation to matter. You have people who are armed. They have been planning this for months, sometimes years. They have a very clear strategy, what they want to do, and the victims are usually surprised. They're usually unarmed. So we would assume that most school shooters, if they plan to kill a certain number of people, they actually end up doing so. And what I actually find is this is still not the case. So a lot, again, happens in the situation that impacts if we end up with a failed school shooting, so where the shooter had the plan to kill many people, but they end up killing no one, or they actually committed mass murder where they killed 4 or more people. So this interest in situations has been something that has interested me since I started my PhD, basically in very different shapes or forms.
And to give the audience an idea about what symbolic interactionism is and kind of the power of it, I think there's a really interesting example that I remember from one of my PhD courses is that we are in all of these social situations where there are no set rules. We don't realize that we've learned and follow a set of kind of scripted interactions, but we do them anyway. And the best example of this is when you walk into an elevator, everybody in the elevator will stand facing the door and will usually not look at each other. And there's no rule of which way you're supposed to stand in an elevator. There's no rule of what you're supposed to do around these strangers, but almost everybody will walk in and face towards the door, even though that's the opposite direction that you just walked in. You know, it would be just as normal if, say, everybody faced the opposite wall. but there's a way that we've learned to have a set of behaviors, and you could map and study and quantify those behaviors and see deviations from the behavior. But it's these little things in life every single day that teach us the way that we are supposed to behave in different situations. And I think that that's what really is amazing in your paper, is that there are ways that people are moving and people are interacting once a shooting starts that really have profound impacts on the way that things play out in these incidents. But before we get into that, so school shooting data is something that I've worked on. It's very difficult to get. It's very difficult to track down all the information about these incidents. You took it to the next level by analyzing video data to then create information about the way that people are moving. But kind of, can you talk me through that process of how you even started to get the information you needed to write this paper?
So this started out as basically first an idea of one one research paper, and then it became a project that got bigger and bigger. And I'm currently revising a book, a manuscript on this as well. But the larger project, I started out with being interested in collecting data on all school shootings that have happened, essentially, because I quickly figured that a lot of the research that exists in the field, they study the same about 10 to 12 cases, 10 to 12 school shootings. And these are usually the most drastic school shootings, so where school shooters killed a lot of victims, which are interesting, but they are not representative for how most school shootings happen. And we also know that there is a number of school shootings where someone went to school, they actually ended up not killing anyone, but still the event is just very traumatizing for everyone who is involved. So these cases also matter. So my interest was collecting a full sample. This means all school shootings that have happened across US history, and to collect in-depth data to understand really what happened in each case. Where was the person marginalized? Did they have family issues? How was the gun access? How did they even get this idea to commit a school shooting and not do anything else with their lives? As well as the situational level data. And as you just mentioned, it's difficult, first of all, to assemble the database, and then secondly, to collect the data. So for the database, I was lucky that I could rely on 5 databases that already existed. One of them was your database. And these 5 databases are from government agencies and research groups and researchers. And each of these 5 is very comprehensive, but some of them only cover a specific time frame. Others cover only university shootings or only K-12 shootings. So I combined these 5, and this ended up being 83 cases of school shootings that I look at. And by school shootings, I mean instances where someone went to their own school to randomly kill other people with a firearm. So this means there's some databases and some colleagues who look at only mass shootings. This means 4 or more people are killed. But I was specifically interested in mass shootings and shootings where more people are killed, as well as shootings where no one was killed. Because what we know is that in a lot of instances, this is by chance that a victim, if the school is close to a hospital, the victim might either survive or die. And the interest was also to compare, if we have shootings where no one was killed, and then we have shootings where a lot of people are killed, how can we avoid these patterns that lead to a lot of victims? Ideally, we would avoid that someone even goes to school and attempts a school shooting. But if a person is already at school, are there specific patterns that we can maybe rely on for avoiding that many victims are killed? And then the second point was the data collection that you asked about. So I mostly relied on document data for the article. I looked for reliable sources, which is much easier in the United States. Since you asked about the US-German comparison, it's fairly easy compared to Germany to get these types of data in the United States and to find them online. From police departments, court documents, a lot of that is online. In some cases, I had CCTV data to look what happened, but in the other cases, for the situational patterns, I mostly relied on document data that had access to CCTV. So I couldn't get CCTV data on all of the cases, which ideally I would have to really track myself who moved where when. But for other cases, I had document data by police departments, for instance, that describe what happened in the video. And I also used autopsy reports because autopsy reports often give a very clear picture of where was someone standing, when was the bullet fired, where did the bullet hit, and give a clear picture of the situational dynamics that I was also very interested in.
And I think that it's important with the criteria that you laid out there, is that kind of dispels one of the most common myths in the United States. I think academic researchers have moved past this, but if you ask the general public, most people think that a school shooting is a mentally deranged outsider who's coming to a school to harm as many random people as possible. But based on studies of this, it's almost always a current or former student with a direct connection to the school who is not mentally ill. They're actually meticulously planning and very lucid as they commit these attacks. And what surprises people is that there are actually, even in a deliberately planned attack where somebody has multiple weapons and lots of ammunition, there are usually very few victims. And so that's kind of the first thing that stood out in your paper is you break these incidents down uh, into quartiles, for the number of victims in each. And in the first quartile, so about 38% of the incidents, there are 0 people killed.
Mhm.
The mean is 2.9. So when you talked about mass shootings that, 4 or more people killed, across all of these incidents, the mean is not even a mass shooting. There are then a very small number of incidents that make up the huge a huge share of the victims. So as you were approaching this, what did you think was really important to differentiate this from those same studies? There are so many books and studies of the same 10 incidents. You know, what was your drive to get, data on the 70 or 80? Because that's a huge endeavor to go through and get all of those records and code all of that information.
Mhm. It is actually, and I've been doing this since almost 10 years now. So this project became bigger and bigger, but I felt that if we only study these 10 cases, we will never, I mean, the research in the field so far has established a profile of school shooters. We know there is specific factors that a lot of school shooters have. But the problem that we always face in the field is that there are so many people that also have this profile, but they never commit a school shooting. There are so many people who also have mental health issues. There are so many people who are also marginalized, bullied, who have troubled family issues, who have easy gun access. Even if you combine all of these factors in a profile and say, okay, a person has all of these factors, there are still millions of people who fit this profile, and they never go out to be randomly attack anyone, let alone commit a school shooting where they
Yeah,
try.
I mean, tens of millions. When you think there's
Right,
60 million kids in K through 12 school, the
right,
estimates are about a third of them have depressions. That's 20
mhm,
million students. About half of kids live in a house with an unsecured gun. That's
right,
30 million students. Reports are more than 50% of students in some national surveys report being bullied. So that's more than 30 million people. So even
exactly.
though we have this profile that it's a current or former student, depressed, suicidal, marginalized, there are 30 million people that fall into that.
Exactly. And so the question is really why then I mean, first of all, the question I think is why would those who have these factors commit a school shooting? Why not do anything else? And I think that's sometimes seen as a given in the literature. Well, they became school shooters, but even if you suffer from all of these factors in your life, there's so many other options. There's other non criminal activities, but there's also other types of crime. And a lot of the literature would also suggest that students would commit suicide. So why do they get the idea to commit a school shooting out of all things they could possibly do? I think that's an interesting question. And the other question is, what actually happens when students go to school? How does a school shooting actually evolve? And here I think it's interesting to look at all the cases because, first of all of them are traumatizing to students, but also to know how prevention could happen. If we know that students have a similar motivation to go into the school and kill as many victims as possible, but then only the majority or the largest group, 40% of school shooters kill no one. The question is, are there things we could do so that most shooters who come to school to attempt a shooting end up killing no one? What are instances or patterns in which we can prevent this, in which we can avoid the loss of life? And this was also something that interested me. What happens in the situational dynamics so that some of them commit a mass shooting and 40% of them actually end up killing no one?
And I think that that's something that gets lost in the data and a lot of the public discourse around this is when you hear one student was shot at a school, you assume that that wasn't a serious incident and that there wasn't a serious risk of that being uh, the next major school shooting. And you highlight a case from 2016 in South Carolina where there was a 14-year-old student, and he planned to kill 50 to 60 students. And he even said that if he got lucky, maybe he'd be able to kill up to 150 students at the school. So I mean, that's getting into like a Las Vegas Harvest Festival type
Hmm.
of death rate. He said it's going to be like shooting fish in a barrel, but that's not what ended up happening. Could you kind of talk through the details of that case and kind of how it fits into some of the patterns you've seen?
Hmm. Exactly. So this is one of the examples that I give, but this is actually a pattern I see across the cases that I studied. So as you said, the shooter previously announced he would kill 50 to 60, maybe 150, and it will be like shooting fish in a barrel. And what he actually did is he ended up going to school, and he was very quickly facing other students and very quickly gave up, crouched, and started crying. So this is interestingly a pattern that I found in a number of cases that students expected previously and also wrote down previously and announced that they expect others to cry and run from them and be afraid, and actually them to sort of walk through the school for a certain amount of time and kill as many victims as possible. And often I think students have these types of numbers in their head. But what you see is actually in a number of instances, students, as soon as they come face to face with victims, or as soon as they are challenged by adults, and this sometimes means just adults saying, give up the weapon. And they very quickly give up. And they very quickly start crying, and they very quickly sort of reinterpret the situation, would say, from a symbolic interactionist perspective. So they go in with this idea of how the shooting will happen, and very quickly, when they're in the situation, they reinterpret the situation they're in. They hear victims crying, they see victims face to face, and these are usually instances in which shooters give up. There's another example I give in the paper of a shooter who had just started his school shooting. And again, he planned this for some time. He made the effort to obtain the firearm. And very quickly after he entered the school, he came face to face with a little girl. And the CCTV shows, and he also said that afterwards, he couldn't get himself to shoot her. And he later also said in an interview, I just couldn't do it. And this is a pattern that I found across cases, that school shooters, as soon as they come face to face with someone, students who are not running away, this little girl who just looked him in the eyes, he couldn't get himself to shoot her. And this was the moment where he gave up, and then was later arrested. So again, he was someone who didn't kill anyone after this face-to-face interaction that he had.
And that's very similar to, I recorded a previous episode with John Romano, who committed
Mhm.
a school shooting. He served 20 years in prison for that, and he's out now. And now he's a mental health advocate and school shooting prevention advocate. But he describes that same situation of it not being what he planned. And once he fired at the first victim, having that immediate feeling of regret. And I,
Mhm.
I think that that's two different interaction pathway factors that you highlight that occur likely in other areas of violence, but you saw here in schools. And one is confrontation tension when people get together. And then also that there's a fear of actually shooting the victims once they're there. Because as you lay out, a school shooting is kids who are defenseless, usually trapped in an area. They begin and end in the same room, most often a classroom. And they usually don't have a high death toll, even though you have all of these factors where there's a person with one or multiple guns, lots of ammo, all the victims in the same space. So, can you kind of talk through what those two interaction pathway factors are, that confrontation tension and the fear of shooting victims?
Mhm. So what I found is, first of all, there is a big difference in whether or not shooters are in the same room, as we would often imagine most school shootings would happen. And this is also the case. I think 93% of shootings are with perpetrators being in the same facility. as their victims. And then there is, I think, 7% who are remote, where the perpetrator is 100 feet or more away from their victims. And what I discussed, first of all, for those who are in the same room, is that these are the instances that I just described, where it's likelier that they would come face to face with a victim. And what I found is that not only do they often stop shooting or do not shoot at someone who they're face to face with, but rather shoot at someone whose face is turned away, but they also actively avoid coming face to face with victims. So I have in some of the cases that I studied, the perpetrator walked around the school to enter from a different door so they would not face students when starting to fire. In other instances, they asked students to get up and then asked them to turn around so they wouldn't be face to face with them. And then the instances in which they fire, it's interesting to see that perpetrators often do not fire when they're face to face. And the instances in which they fire is often when the victims are behind doors, when they have their heads turned and they are running away, when there's smoke and they can't really see who they're firing at. So instances where the face and microsociological theory would assume the humanity of the other person is not really visible, where it's mostly shooting at silhouettes of people, at moving targets, in their perspective, running away of a crowd of people that has turned the other way and tries to flee. And these are actually, things that make sense from the victim's perspective, right? It obviously makes sense to try to escape the situation and run away. But what we know from the microsociology of violence is that these are instances that make it easier for perpetrators to shoot at victims, rather than...
That aligns with, there's a lot of literature and studying of hostage situations, which fortunately are not common now, but were pretty widespread in the 1950s, 60s, early 70s. There was a landmark study by the FBI in the 1970s that kind of led to the concept of hostage negotiation, which didn't exist before. You had very high fatalities in hostage situations prior to the idea of negotiating with a hostage taker. And it also created a whole body of evidence around hostage survival, which is, the opposite of run, hide, fight. It's to be human, to look the hostage taker in the face, to say your name, to say personal details, to try to connect in all the ways that can make you seem human in a non-threatening manner, that actually you can have a very high level of survival in a situation where somebody's holding you at gunpoint if you humanize them, if you humanize yourself, and then you give time to have a situation negotiated by a trained psychologist. You can resolve lots of hostage situations without a single shot being fired. I've studied, there have been about 60 at schools. They don't happen very often now, but they used to be really common. Half of those were resolved without a single shot being fired. And I think that really aligns to your finding that somebody doesn't want to hurt someone else that they're forced to come face to face with and have this human interaction with.
Right. And that's something that we also see, for instance, in other scholars have pointed out in executions, that people are made to face the other way, or even snipers and professional hitmen try to shoot victims when they're with their face turned in the back of the head, which in many cases, and this is, I think, also quite interesting in school shootings, it doesn't really make sense from the perspective of the perpetrator. First of all, if the goal is to shoot as many victims as possible, it would make more sense to shoot at those that I can clearly see and that at those who are close to me. But also,
and just to highlight that, because I mean, this is just, it's so interesting in the context of all these incidents. This didn't meet your criteria because this was not a student at the school. But there was a sniper attack in Washington, D.C. in 2022 at the Edmund Burke School. That's like the most prestigious private school in Washington, D.C. It's right in Embassy Row, in like the best neighborhood of the city. And this guy rented the 5th story apartment that was overlooking the school, and he had 6 rifles and about 1,000 rounds of ammo. And he could have waited until dismissal when all of the students would be in front. But he opened fire just before dismissal, on this glass sky bridge that students were walking across that connected two buildings on campus. And when they're on this glass sky bridge, they're just shadows, they're just silhouettes.
Mhm.
And what had the makings of being probably one of the most deadly shootings in U.S. history turned out to be 4 people wounded,
Mhm.
because the shooter was not proficient and he shot at silhouettes rather than shooting at people when they'd be visible outside of the school.
Right. And that's, I mean, quite interesting. And in a number of shootings as well, you have similar dynamics, I would say. You have, for instance, the Columbine shooting that is very infamous for the shooters killing a large number of victims, which they did. If you look at how long it took police to arrive and how many victims were still in the school, it's surprising that so many of them were not killed, that the body count was not much, much higher. And when you look at this shooting in greater detail, you see that a number of the victims were killed when they were hiding under tables in the cafeteria. So shooters were just passing by. They didn't lean down to look at victims. So this means they usually probably just only saw their feet, maybe their legs, didn't see them face to face. Victims were already crouching under tables. They were tending to others, often those who were shot, and they were also systematically shooting at those who were further away. And again, this, I mean, first of all, it doesn't make sense from the perspective of the perpetrator if their goal is to kill as many victims as possible, because if they would shoot at those who are closer, they would be more likely to hit their victims. But also in school shootings, this increases the chance that someone comes and tackles you. If you have a person that is much closer to you and you shoot at someone who is further away, which the Columbine shooters and many other shooters systematically do, you have another person in the same room as you who is close to you who could potentially take your gun. Still, these are not the people who, in most instances, get shot, but usually the people whose faces are turned, who are under the tables, who are tending to others, who are focused on something else, and those who are further away. And all of this speaks for shooters actively avoiding face-to-face confrontation and shooting those victims where they don't come face-to-face.
Yeah, and I think that is really reinforced by the shooting at Central Visual and Performing Arts High School in St. Louis 3 years ago. And that was a former student who knew the layout of the school. He was suicidal. He'd planned extensively for more than a year. He had an AR-15 and 600 rounds of ammo, but 2 people were killed
Mm-hmm.
in that shooting, and they were both killed when he first took stairs up to the 3rd floor of the school. It was a long hallway, 100-year-old building, and it was the shots that he fired down the hallway really randomly without being able to see who he was shooting at, who were the 2 victims killed.
Mm-hmm.
And then everybody injured was, as he walked around, he fired through doors and through walls. And even though there were still hundreds of people in the building, he just waited in a hallway for an extended period of time until police found him. So he was inside of the school with an AR-15 rifle and 600 rounds of ammo for 15 minutes
Mm-hmm.
before police found him. But 2 people were killed. And I've watched the CCTV video of all of that. There are multiple times where he comes face to face, especially with the unarmed school security guards, and he doesn't shoot at any of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's also something that I find, and that is interesting. You mentioned just the fact that often they are former or current students. So this also means not only are they planning for a long time, they also know, as you just said, the layout of the school very well, and usually they also know what students will do in a lockdown drill. So this is also something that is quite interesting. That these drills, of course, they prepare students. I mean, we can talk about sort of how useful they are and how traumatizing they are, but the idea is, of course, to train students in order to get away. But in these instances, these school shootings that I look at, the shooter usually trains with their victim, so they are very well aware where victims will hide, where victims will go, which again you would think gives them an advantage to achieve what they set out their goal is, which is usually at least to commit a mass shooting, at least to kill 4 or more people, which, as you said, I think in about 20% committed mass murder. And the majority does not do so. And these are instances, as you just described, where there are many more people that the shooter could shoot at. A number of the shooters also have incredible amounts of ammunition that they bring in anticipation of shooting 100, 200, 300 rounds. And actually what they do is shoot fairly little compared to how much they could shoot, and compared to that this is actually their main goal. I mean, it's not for them, they don't want to get anywhere and do anything else. Their main goal is actually to shoot at as many people as possible. And then it's quite striking, as you just said, when you see the video of them repeatedly opting out of that when they come face to face with someone, when they actually see their victims.
And that played out twice in recent incidents with two students in different states who were connected. In December, there was a teenage girl who opened fire inside a Christian school in Madison, Wisconsin, in her classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And it turned out after the fact, she had two pistols and extra ammo. She only fired shots from the first one. And then killed herself with extra ammunition still in the very first magazine that she had. And just about a month later, a student who she had been communicating with online in Nashville committed a school shooting in the cafeteria of his school when lunch started. And he had written that he intended to kill dozens of students, but he ended up firing about 7 shots in the cafeteria, striking one girl, and then killing himself without using any of his extra ammunition. And he had unspent rounds in the magazine for that first gun. So I think that that's something that has been an issue. Is you point this out, that there are 5 incidents that account for 45% of the fatalities in school shootings in the US. And those incidents have been studied and written about so much that they've created all of this planning and policy and response procedures around a shooting that is going to stop until there's violent intervention by police, by armed school staff. That is this myth that's just reinforced and drives almost all policy in the United States right now. But that's not the case at all. I mean, where do we take this research when there are 5 incidents that have basically defined all policy that's used at all schools and police departments in the United States, but they are not representative of this problem? Like, where do we go next from there?
Right. Well, I think one aspect is, first of all, to highlight, and I was very surprised by this, how strong of an outlier these cases are, right? So these are 5 shooters that are strong outliers, and they are responsible for 110 victims. So 45% of the victims in all school shootings in the US were killed by these 5 shooters. So they are very strong outliers in that regard. And as you said, they get the majority of media attention and a lot of the policies that are created around them. I think one part of this is looking at and this is part of what I do in the article, looking at how does the situation evolve in which they are able to kill that many victims. And I think another part is also to look at policy and prevention in general from a broader perspective. I think a lot of these cases and a lot of these school shootings, the assumption is that it is easy for shooters to kill many victims, and that a lot has to be done, a lot of money has to be spent to sort of create fortresses. I think you also had one episode on fortresses in your podcast. What from sort of the broader analysis that I did on these cases and the rest of the cases, a lot of the prevention measures so far, a lot of what informs policy, we know that it doesn't really work that well. We know that there's this militarization of schools, metal detectors, armed personnel, backpack bans. None of this prevented any of these 5 shootings. Threat assessments and profiling sometimes of millions of students who fit under this profile and who are then closely being watched often at school. Will they turn to be the next school shooter, where this is usually kids that are already severely struggling, that need support? And then zero tolerance policies that often increase the school to prison pipeline and are often um, again fostering racist discrimination. So there are a number of policies and prevention that so far are implemented, and there's a lot of money spent on them that don't really work. What my study suggests is one aspect that would work much better is creating a nurturing school environment, environment where students have better access to counseling, where the school is able to counteract bullying, to counteract ideas of masculinity, where students have to toughen up, basically, creating a sense of belonging. So when things are bad at home, when they start to hear voices, when they feel depressed, they have someone where they can turn to and ask for help. And I mean, basically just giving teachers and school personnel also these resources. I think the idea could not be to ask teachers to do all of these things, but they also probably need the resources to do so. And I think another aspect that was very prevalent in these cases that I studied was access to firearms at home, unguarded access to firearms, mental health care access, and fighting stigmatization. And then media portrayals of school shooters. That a lot of the shooters that I study, and this is also for these 5 cases that are outliers, they are often in situations where they feel they need to get out of the situation. I described this in another paper as social pressure cooker. They're in situations where they're marginalized, they're bullied, they have very troubled family experiences where they're abused. And then they often try to find a way out. A number of them, for instance, try to join the military, but they are rejected. And this is an instance where they look for a way out. They look to change their situation. They asked teachers for help. They couldn't help. They asked other people, other adults for help who wouldn't help. And then someone suggests, well, someone in your situation could commit a school shooting. You fit the profile of a school shooter. Or they read on the news, well, someone like me just committed a school shooting. And this is sort of how this idea is created, of identifying with, this is an option forward. This is something that I could do and that people in my situation actually do. And then I think another big aspect for prevention, especially for these 5 cases, is to look at how can we create a situation where shooters cannot basically stay with their interpretation frame as they do in these 5 cases. The 5 outlier cases, from a situational perspective, they are much longer. A number of them are much longer. 2 of them are, I think, one is 60, one is 90 minutes. So I think a fast police response is one of the, I think, very obvious factors. 2 of them are attacks on smaller children, which makes a difference for the situation, because the shooters know that they are faced with kids that are sometimes 6, 8, 10 years old. So they will immediately group with a teacher and try to run away. So they will definitely be faced with victims that will not be face to face with them, which creates for them a favorable situation of groups of people running away. And then I think 2 of the other cases where you can say, okay, they didn't have so much more time. They didn't have small children that they attacked, where they had a situation where people were immediately running away. One of the cases I discuss in more detail in the paper is the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018, the Parkland shooting. And here what is interesting is that this is, again, an outlier in terms of how many victims were killed, but it also shows that a lot of the patterns that avoid high victim numbers in other cases are absent here. So one aspect that happened in Parkland was that because of the firing of the assault rifle, there was a lot of smoke. So the perpetrator already couldn't see the victims that well anymore. He would only see silhouettes. The fire alarm went off at school because of the smoke. And this led to students all come running outside. So they were all in the hallway, crowded, when the shooter came to the hallway. And so then they only had the option to turn and run the other way. Because the third factor that was very important here was that they could not get back into their rooms because the lockdown and the fire alarm drill both had sort of included that the doors were locked. And so this created a situation where there were a number of students with their back to the shooter in smoke, where the shooter could only see their silhouettes, and they had no other option than turning their back to the shooter and running away. And so this was a very favorable situation. And the good news is that there's a lot of things that you can do to prevent these types of situations, that you can prevent these outliers by being there faster and by avoiding these spatial settings and these situational settings that allow shooters to avoid face-to-face confrontation and be confronted with a number of victims.
What struck me reading this is the implications that those findings have for the standard procedure for lockdowns in schools, that shooters don't want to confront a victim face to face. They'd rather shoot at an obscured victim, and they'd rather shoot at a silhouette. So the standard lockdown procedure in a school is that you turn the lights off in a classroom. So that's going to obscure the view. You have the students go to what's called the hard corner, even though it's not actually a hard corner, because you can shoot through the walls very easily. A block wall does not stop a bullet from an assault rifle. And then kids are told to be quiet and told to hide. And you see the pictures over and over from lockdown drills. Kids are usually in kind of that tornado, nuclear bomb position of they're covering their head and face with their hands in the corner. And based on your findings, the school shooter is a current or former student, so they know the lockdown plan. They're not tricked into thinking that a dark classroom means that there's nobody in there.
Right.
So you're giving them the ideal situation of a darkened room, clustered victims who are quiet and not facing them. And then also they're going to know where in the classroom they are. So if they'd rather just walk down the hallway and shoot through the walls, there were victims killed and injured in Uvalde who were shot through the walls. There were victims killed and injured at CVPA who were shot through the walls. The lockdown, it seems to me, is actually creating the most dangerous possible situation that gives the biggest advantage to the shooter possible, based on your research.
Right. And the question would be what the alternative would be. And this is something that I'm still wanted to do more research on. But you're absolutely right. A lot of the measures that are taken during lockdown, and one example is the Parkland shooting, actually create a situation that makes it much more likely that the school will have a high body count. So the perpetrator will be able to kill a large number of victims. I think generally, of course, the idea to run, hide, fight makes a lot of sense. I don't think it makes sense to suggest to students stand face to face with a shooter. You never really know how the person would react. You can't really sort of recommend that because it's a life or death situation, and you don't want anyone to face a perpetrator. But what we also know is that hiding and running away, if you're very close to the shooter and you turn and run away, this is for the shooter an ideal situation. And for any person who wants to commit violence, hiding your face, in instances on the street, people often put their hoodies up or put music on. These are actually very bad things to do, because for the perpetrator, for someone who wants to commit violence, that makes it easier for them to attack their victims. So a lot of the things that are recommended, hiding and running away, actually foster these types of situations. So what I propose in the paper is to think about smart ways to get students into a safe distance from the shooter, where they're not in the same room, where they're not right behind the door, and the shooter knows they're hiding behind the table, they're hiding behind the door, or they will definitely all turn their backs and run the other way. But to think about outside of the box, what are solutions that we can have in schools? What are spatial settings that we can set up where, first of all, the shooter is surprised and they thereby may be taken out of their interpretation context? Are there any things, and that doesn't need to be humans, this could also be other things that happen at school that take the shooter out of their rhythm, that surprise the shooter, that may lead or may be favorable to a reinterpretation of what is happening. And also, how can victims get away from the shooter without increasing the chance that the shooter will actually fire at them? And I think these are open questions still to answer. But I think one thing that is important to note also in these drills is a lot of people who participate in drills think that they will be safe if they hide. They think that this is sort of a solution or the best solution for the moment. And if they are behind a table, this gives them a sense of safety. And I think it's important to note that this makes it more likely for the shooter to actually fire at the person if they are hiding behind an object or if they are right behind the door. If it's dark, that doesn't mean that the shooter will not see them and it becomes less likely, but rather it becomes more likely that the shooter will fire in their direction and eventually hit the victim.
Well, something that I've written about from studying, I have one of the criteria or one of the categories in the school shooting database is whether it was a pre-planned attack or not. And I have about 230 of those cases back to the 1960s. And from looking at those, if people could get away, because 80% of those begin and end in the same room, I think my most practical solution to any school is make sure every single room has 2 doors. And, we're spending enormous amounts of money retrofitting schools with bulletproof windows or bulletproof doors or all these different security systems for almost no money. If a classroom doesn't have it already and it's on the first floor, have a door or have a window that's easily opened so people can get out of there. If it's a second or third floor classroom, there are also lots of options. Back to central visual and performing arts, the students jumped out of the windows. And students lived because they got out of rooms where, there were hundreds of rounds fired in that school, but the students got out of the windows. I mean, my number one piece of advice from looking at 60 years of these incidents is if you hear gunshots and you're in a room, get as far away from that building as you can, as quickly as you can. I see a practical application from your paper is that we're actually doing probably exactly the wrong thing by first huddling in the corner, but then turning out the lights and being quiet. If anything, people should be as loud and as human as possible. I wonder if it's almost that, kids should start singing or you should start playing music or something that humanizes all the people in the room. So let's not turn out the lights, number one, because you've got a lot of evidence that that's bad. But anything that makes people more human to the attacker is going to change that circumstance. If people are huddled on the ground, that's the most likely way that they're going to be killed. I'm not sure how you would test this because this is not an area for natural experiment, and it's an extremely high likelihood of liability and
Right.
huge consequence if you make a different procedure and then people are killed following it or trying it. But we know that the status quo doesn't work. Since Columbine, since lockdowns became standard, there are more incidents and they have more fatalities than before the lockdown existed. So we really have to rethink that procedure.
Right. I absolutely agree. And the same for, I think the shooter being in the same room, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. Ideally, there is a different door where students can get out of. If students are in the same room, a lot of research also on other instances of violence shows if people are crouching down, not showing their face, if people are whining and crying, which obviously is very understandable in these types of situations. So it's also often hard to, say, okay, this is what victims should do, because obviously the victims are not at fault in any case. But there are certain drills and certain procedures that can increase the likelihood, of course, for a victim not to get shot. And whining, crying, ducking down, being in a darker room, all of these will increase the likelihood to get shot at. And there's also, I think, in other instances, violence researchers would suggest to get up, to throw things, to be loud, to make yourself big, to be face to face. as you said, these are instances where I wouldn't really want to make a recommendation, because it's very hard to say, well, be face to face with a school shooter. And then you don't want to be responsible for the situation escalating, or the person getting shot. But I think what the paper suggests, or what my research so far suggests, is that a next step would be to think about school shootings from a situational perspective, and to reevaluate the lockdown drills that we have, and to think about, is there a different angle that we can look at this from, and see how can we create situations where we can still get people out of the room, where we can still, I mean, the main idea is to avoid people getting shot. And are there situations where we don't create these situations, as you just said, by ducking down, by being in a darker room, that all help the shooter in that instance, but rather think about situational steps that make it less likely for the shooter to shoot, whatever these might be. Maybe it's I don't know, mirrors that the shooter sees themselves, or whatever it is. Thinking outside of the box, what could disrupt their rhythm? Is it loud music or something else? I mean, still, the efforts of getting people out of school need to be able to go on, and you don't want to confuse students in the school. And again, if shooters know the drill, it's more likely that they can prepare for it, and so it's less likely that they will be surprised by anything the school will do that could catch them off rhythm. But I think thinking outside the box and thinking situationally about school shootings, I think this is a very new thing in many ways. About what happens in the situation, and what can we do when we take face-to-face confrontation into consideration.
Well, it's also what happened before there were standard lockdown procedures and standard training, is people were actually naturally dynamic in situations, even young kids. I think back to Jonesboro, Arkansas in 1998, which was one of your distance attacks. So a sniper attack at the school where the two kids had a dozen different weapons. They had a lot of ammunition. They pulled the fire alarm so that when the kids filed out, they opened fire. And this is 1998. So it's at a middle school. None of the middle school kids had any specific training for what to do during a shooting. They had the training for the fire alarm, that when you hear the bells, you walk out. And when they walked out, and then all of a sudden they were getting shot at, they all started running back into the school. They naturally knew in that environment, wait a second, what we've been trained to do is not right. Is not safe to evacuate right now. We are going to run back inside. And that is a shooting that could have had dozens of people killed, but instead there were two people killed. So people do naturally know what to do before any of this happens. I think some pushback I've heard about rapid evacuation is, oh, well, yeah, how could we ever do a rapid evacuation from a school? Well, kids practice that at dismissal every single day. I mean, kids leave the school as quickly as they can. Many of them walk home. Many of them take city buses. Many of them bike. There are all these ways that kids take care of themselves in some of the most dangerous parts of the United States every day. So we've just got to, I think, ground this in research, just to kind of summarize a few things that I think just stand out so much. There are so much literature on school shootings is based on the same 10 incidents. So much policy is based on the same 5 shooters. And the procedures that have become standard have resulted in more incidents with more fatalities than before we even had lockdown procedures. And I think that that's why your paper is so important, that little things like keeping the lights on, like if you are trapped facing the shooter, if you aren't trapped getting as far away from the building as possible, this is practical stuff that doesn't cost any money, doesn't take any extra investment, but I think really has the potential to save a lot of lives.
Yeah, and I think another aspect would be to, in the future, compare that to other types of rampage shootings, right? Workplace shootings, shootings at religious facilities. So are there differences in spatial setups, maybe, that lead to a difference in how the shootings evolve in other cases? And can we learn from that? I think I would still be cautious to make any clear recommendations of facing the shooter, for instance. But I think this is something that we need to think about. How can we, as you said, leaving the lights on, and avoiding these situations where people huddle together in the back corner and the shooter exactly knows where they are because they participated in the same drills. And I think there is still a lot of potential to improve these reactions, to improve what sort of schools can do, but also what first responders and police officers that arrive at the scene can do, so that these sort of instances that are already rare in the database, where a lot of victims are killed, that we ideally we wouldn't have anyone going to school and committing a shooting. But if there is someone who goes to school to commit a shooting, that ideally all of them resolve in no victims being shot or killed, by focusing more on these situational dynamics.
So before we get out of here, you mentioned briefly that you're drafting a manuscript right now, and this is going to become a book. Can you give any preview of that, or let us know when it's going to be coming out?
I'm currently revising it, so I think it will still be some time, but I'm currently publishing a number of papers already from the book. So I think the situational aspects will play a big role in this book because it's just so surprising how clear these patterns are. And I'm describing a number of school shootings and how they evolve, how they unfold in the book, and a strong focus on these situational patterns. And other aspects that I look at is what actually led someone to go to the school and commit a school shooting. So I'm looking at what I call context level constellations, like marginalization, mental health. How do they play together? How do they create a situation where the shooter perceives they need to change something and get out? Then I look at the identification as a school shooter. What happens so that someone in this situation has the idea, okay, I'm going to commit a school shooting out of all other possible things that I could do. And then I look at easy gun access. And this was something that was very striking in my research so far, that all of the shooters, so everyone in the sample had very easy gun access, or easy gun access, so could grab the gun from home. I'm currently revising the book, so I think it's still probably going to be some time until the book is out. But the paper on gun availability will come out fairly soon, I think in a month or so, in PLOS One.
Well, it sounds like we'll need to have another conversation in a month or so once
I'm
that
looking
comes
forward to
out,
that.
because if it's anything like this paper, it's something that's unique, that's well written, that's engaging, and really sheds light on the topic. I think that sometimes you need, kind of an outsider. You're in Germany. You're not here in the U.S. thinking about these issues through our lenses and specific framework. So it can be, really helpful to have a fresh perspective on this. I'll have a link to this paper and your website in the show notes. Is there anywhere else that people in the audience can find you if they want to reach out to you or contact you?
Oh, sure. I'm at University of Erfurt. So if you just Google my name, University Erfurt, there's also my email, and feel free to contact me.
All right, well, Dr. Ann Nasser is a sociologist in Germany and an expert on symbolic interactionism. The paper, An Interactional Pathway of Mass Killings Towards a Novel Understanding of Rampage School Shootings, is an absolute must read for anybody in this field. There's a link to it in the show notes. And Anna, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.